Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fiber Broadband Association's Five for Breakfast. We're now on our 43rd episode of 2025. Before we kick off, I'd like to thank Wesco, the platinum sponsor of Five for Breakfast. Well, in Washington, we're now on day 22 of the government shutdown with no clear path forward to reopening the government. The Senate has held its 11th unsuccessful vote on the House-passed funding bill on Monday evening. The House has been out of session for over a month, so there's been very little activity in the House committees. And due to the government shutdown, the FBA's fall Washington fly-in, originally scheduled for next week, has obviously been postponed. So we'll keep everybody informed when we reschedule our fly-in. The FCC recently issued a notice of inquiry asking for public comment on state local regulatory barriers that can slow the deployment of wireline telecommunications infrastructure and what the FCC can or should do to address these issues. So initial comments are due on November 17th, and replies are due on December 17th. On Monday, October 27th, FBA will file brief reply comments in response to the FCC's network modernization notice of proposed rulemaking. The deadline may also be moved due to the shutdown. Last week, the Fiber Broadband Association held its Tribal Broadband Regional Fiber Connect Workshop in Scottsdale, Arizona. And we greatly appreciate Arizona Governor Katie Hobbs for coming and joining us. And her keynote was amazing, and really appreciate her efforts of working with the Department of Commerce to help ensure that the BEAD non-deployment funds are put to work by the states. It's also great to hear from the Arizona's broadband director, Nick Capuzzi, who has done a tremendous job during his tenure. We also heard from a number of incredible tribal leaders at our event. Tribal broadband is a top priority for Fiber Broadband Association, and it was awesome to have such a great turnout in Scottsdale. Also last week, we were down in Bogota, Colombia for our final Latin America Fiber Connect event. And again, just an amazing turnout, and we look forward to getting hit into about 4 Latin America events again next year. So our next Fiber Connect workshop, our last one for the year, will be in Kansas City on November 11th. This is already panning out to be the biggest, most attended event in our schedule for the year. I don't know what's going on in Kansas City. Maybe Taylor Swift will be there or something, but we're going to definitely be sell out, standing room only crowd. And then followed by that, we'll be in Palm Springs on December 8th and 9th for our premier member meeting. So we'll look forward to seeing you there. Today on Five for Breakfast, our guest is Jonathan Chambers, the co-CEO of Conexon, for a fireside chat on the practical divide between marketing claims, speed tests, and delivered speeds. Before I formally introduce today's guest, I'd like to introduce David Norris from the team, who's going to walk us through some housekeeping items.
Thank you very much, Gary, and good morning to everyone who's joined us today. We appreciate it. Before I go over a few logistics, we'd like to once again thank our platinum sponsor, Fiber for Breakfast, Wesco. Now, as participants, you are in listen-only mode today. To ask a question, please type it into the question box, which is located on your screen. We will host a Q&A session with our panelists at the end of today's discussion. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on FBA's website within 24 to 48 hours, and you can find that recording in the Events tab under the Fiber for Breakfast drop-down option. Finally, at the conclusion of today's presentation, you'll be prompted to complete a brief feedback survey. Please take a moment to respond. We appreciate your input. With that, I will pass things back to Gary to get us started. Gary?
Thanks, David, and good morning. I'm Gary Bolton, the President and CEO of the Fiber Broadband Association. Last week in Five for Breakfast, our guest was our good friend, Jeff Hainan from Deloro, who discussed the Deloro Group's 5-year broadband access and home networking forecast. My biggest takeaway from our discussion with Jeff is that 25 gig PON is already taken off in commercial deployments, and 50 gig PON will soon be in volume deployment. So we also discussed, the Wi-Fi 6E evolution to Wi-Fi 7 and the challenges that Wi-Fi is going to have keeping up with all the bandwidth that's going to be delivered by fiber to the home. So if you missed last week's session, you can go to our website and watch the replay. Today on Five for Breakfast, our guest is Jonathan Chambers, the co-CEO for Conexon, for a fireside chat on the practical divide between marketing claims, speed tests, and delivered speeds. So for over 30 years, Jonathan has been deeply involved in and influenced the development of government telecommunications policy and deployment of internet access networks. Early in his career, Jonathan worked in the U.S. Senate as a Republican staff director of the U.S. Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. And during that time, the committee overhauled most of the federal laws that today still govern the telecommunications industry, including wireless, cable, telephone, and internet access industries. Later, Jonathan worked in the US and Europe with cable television and wireless providers as the first broadband and digital mobile networks were planned, designed, and constructed. And then in 2012, he returned to the federal government as the chief of the Office of Strategic Planning for the FCC. He was the principal advocate for the reforms that altered the $12 billion in annual FCC spending from support of voice services to support of broadband services, and from subsidies for incumbents to competitive bidding. And then early in 2016, Jonathan has worked primarily with electric co-ops to bring the much needed fiber broadband to rural America. And under his leadership, rural electric co-ops have collectively secured more federal broadband funding than any other group in the country. And in 2021, his expert guidance of Conexon's Rural Electric Co-op Consortium, made up of nearly 90 co-ops, received more than $1.1 billion through the FCC's RDOF Phase 1 auction to deliver fiber broadband services to rural America throughout the country. Jonathan's the author of widely read Co-ops Connect FYI, Weekly Industrial Email, and he has a BA from Yale and a master's in international affairs from Columbia, and JD from Georgetown Law School. So with all that, Jonathan, welcome so much. You're definitely one of our popular guests. And for our audience, please type in your questions during our fireside chat, and we'll work those in discussions. So to kick things off, tell me a little bit about how I know that you kind of were there at the pioneering telecom policy, and worked through developing some of the first networks. But how did Conexon come all together and your focus on rural electric co-ops?
Thanks, Gary. Good to be back with you. It's been a few years, but underexposure is always a little bit better than overexposure. So glad to be back with you at this point in time. To answer your question, when I was at the Federal Communications Commission, one of the projects that I worked on together with the teams from the Wireline Competition Bureau and Wireless Bureau, the auction folks, was how to effectuate the plans the FCC laid out in its 2010 National Broadband Report, and then its 2011 series of orders about getting broadband out to rural America. It wasn't until then that the FCC began to subsidize, began to spend public funds for broadband. That is, this is a pretty recent phenomenon, just in the last 15 years. At the time, we went through the commission, the public, state broadband offices that had been set up pursuant to the 2009 funding. People were looking at this question back then, again, not that long ago. And the questions are always the same. That is, starting with, what do you define? What's your definition of broadband? Both for purposes of what are you going to fund? What is insufficient? What areas have insufficient access to broadband? In order to answer that question, you have to have a definition for broadband. So what is broadband? And then when you're funding as a public entity, if you're using public funds, what are you going to pay for? That is, what's the broadband you're going to fund? How are you going to allocate the money? Who's going to get the money? What's the assignment mechanism? Are you going to have an application process? Are you going to set up a whole bunch of criteria? Are you going to do an auction? What's the mechanism that you're going to use? So the way I got into what I do today is through that series of examination of questions. And something that was, I don't know, somewhat serendipitous, which is I met with a group of rural electric cooperatives who at the time were interested in serving their communities with broadband in the same way that electric cooperatives had been formed in the 1930s, 1940s to build out electric infrastructure in those places that were too sparsely populated to support the economics of the sort of investor-owned utility industry. Those co-ops from the 30s are largely the same co-ops today. And the thing that the sort of thunderbolt moment for me was when the electric co-ops who were visiting me shared with me a simple map that is a map of where electric co-ops existed. And then I took that map and I overlaid it with the FCC's map as to where we at the time believed the areas that lacked broadband. That is, the areas we were going to fund with public dollars. It's not an exact overlay one over the other, but it's about as close as you would ever get, for the simple reason that it always comes down to sparsity. It always comes down to sort of the lack of density, population density, so that folks, the industry, this is the marketplace shortcoming that justifies government intervention. Because there are parts of the country that over and over, whether it was electricity, telephone, cable, broadband, whatever it was that requires more density in order to support the economics, you got that with broadband in the 2010s, just like you had it with 80 years ago, 80 years before that, with electricity. So that to me, the combination of that infrastructure exists, the electric infrastructure exists, and if you were to leverage the electric infrastructure, poles, ducts, conduits, rights of way, community organizations, and ability to leverage the existing infrastructure to borrow funds at low interest rates, the financial institutions, the membership organizations themselves, if you were to leverage all of that, you could replicate the same story. The same 1930s story could occur again. And that's what attracted me to it. That it was a combination of technology, network construction, which had always been involved in for years and years, and communities, local communities doing for themselves that which other companies had left aside properly, couldn't make a buck serving these communities. So the communities stepped up themselves, and that's what I saw occurring in the early 2010s. Local communities stepping up for themselves, and what the co-ops were coming to the FCC for was to seek access to public funding, the very public funding that the FCC was planning for, in order to support the deployment of high-speed internet access in rural areas. So it was for me a marriage of experience and inspiration. That is, the inspiration that came from community-led organizations that wanted to serve their own communities, and in large part, Conexon, led by my business partner Randy Clint, and the hundreds of people and then thousands of people that worked with us. In large part, we did what we set out to do. In places like Mississippi, where the first electric co-ops were formed, the electric co-ops there then built out fiber networks. Everywhere that the electric co-ops embraced this role, they built out fiber networks to their members. And it's been, for me, sort of the most rewarding decade. We're now a 10-year-old company. It's been the most rewarding professional experience of my life.
Well, congratulations. And, everybody knows that I absolutely love rural electric co-ops. Every time I go to have lunch with a general manager of a rural electric co-op, the accountability, they cannot walk into a restaurant without every single person in the restaurant making a comment to them. They know, everybody knows where they go to church. Everybody knows, sees them at the baseball game. Everybody sees, so they are 100% accountable to their community. And then also, I love the fact that they know how to invest in critical infrastructure, and they do not look short-sighted. They always do put the right facilities in for the long term and the best return on investment. So again, just congratulations, and I love that market segment, and it's the fastest growing market segment. So on the B, so when you look at you guys, you had a consortium of over 90 rural electric co-ops for RDOF, which to me, the failure of RDOF was qualifying the bidders after the auction. So you had a group of highly qualified bidders versus some of the awardees that have gone in default or been rescinded and so forth. So you go from that, I'll call it a cluster, to the current most recent benefit of the bargain, BEAD. So you guys get 1.1 billion. You did what, under 100 million or so in the BEAD. What was the difference, and why is it that the success was different, or maybe your focus was different, I should say?
Yeah. So in BEAD, we as a company have won $200+ million, but that's just us as a company. That's not all of the co-ops that were part of our consortium. I don't. BEAD's a different type of program, state-driven with federal rules. I'm not gonna. I'll just make, one point about my own sort of philosophy about the best way to distribute public funds, but then move on from it, because I'm not, I'm not really interested in. I do enough backward looking in my life. I don't need to do that in every facet of my life. I don't need to go through a whole, who shot John? What's the BEAD is now established and finally moving on. I mean, my own approach in funding programs has been you try to get whatever you're trying to accomplish, you try to get it down to one single number. There's an old, if you're familiar with the book and the movie Moneyball, there's a scene in the movie in which the character, sort of a acolyte of Bill James, who was studied numbers in baseball. He's explaining to the Billy Bean character what he was trying to do, which he said you try to take all of the statistics you have and you try to bring it down to a single number. For them, the single number was kind of how often do you get on base right. Percentage. On base percentage. For me, that you try to there's so much going on when you're discussing how you should build broadband, who should get the money, what criteria do you want? Some combination of, do you want to measure speeds? Do you want to say it has to do with I don't know, community involvement? Does it have to do with technology? That obscures, and it makes it difficult to then define who should get the money. If you can bring it down to one number, and that number I always thought was the best number, is what's going to be the cost to the public of the winning bidder delivering the highest quality service. If you don't have anybody who deliver the highest quality service, then you have a kind of a waterfall function and you go to a lower quality service. But who would deliver the highest quality service for the least amount of money for the public? That single number leads you to an auction process. That's not what BEAD was. BEAD was a series of applications with a bunch of criteria. And then interestingly enough, after several years of the Biden administration, really, I'm not here to criticize, but they sort of failed to get off the mark. Still at the starting gate, still there in the blocks or behind it, didn't ever move. All the preparation and then no execution. Interestingly enough, what the Trump administration did is they kind of brought it back down to that single number. That's what BEAD was then based on this past summer. Again, I would have disagreed that you should have had, again, my approach was always the single number applied to the best service available. But look, you know, they're the decision makers. New administration gets their opportunity to rewrite the rules. So, you know, it's the way our system works. I will give a lot of credit for them to get BEAD moving. The worst thing about BEAD has been the delay, the wait, because there's a disincentive for anybody to build in a rural area where there was BEAD funding. Because if you build something, you built yourself out of the funding opportunity. So there was actually, instead of a program that was meant to get rural broadband, to get networks built, it had the opposite effect. For going on 4 years now, anybody with any kind of economic prudence, anybody looking at this would say, I'm not building there because there will be BEAD funds. And if I apply and I win the BEAD funds, I am going to have a network that costs me less and it's going to be more valuable to me. So there has been a slowdown and a stoppage of construction in rural America at the very time that rural America most needed it. So I give all the credit in the world to the current Commerce Department Trump administration to say, let's get moving. Let's set some deadlines. They set some hard deadlines. Those deadlines were met by the states, now about to get BEAD funding. So great. What my focus is right now, we have about, just us as a company, have about $1 billion worth of networks to construct over the next couple of years that we've been waiting on. So we're going to get about that. Now, for purposes of our conversation, let me just suggest one thing, because nobody should care about what we do, really. It's whatever, you know, we've got a business to run. But I think it is a good time to take a step back and lift our gaze up, to look at what we as a nation, we as an industry should do before we reach this question again, and go back to some first principle questions. The one I mentioned earlier. Sounds like the most simplistic thing, but what is broadband? What is broadband that should be the goal of the country to get not rural America? What are we building towards? And let me just mention, I'll always remember a conversation I had with a mentor of mine back in the early 1990s. He was with the cable industry, which was starting to plan for, design, build. DOCSIS was in the works. They were looking at broadband. And he said to me, he said, the internet, I mean, you know, in retrospect, so you'd say, of course, right? But at the time, he said, the internet will change everything. He said, that's our belief as a company. The internet will change everything. And every company that understands that, gets that now, understands it, plans for it, sees how it's going to affect them, because it's going to change everything, every aspect of society, every business, every person. It's going to change everything. If you plan for it and you anticipate it and you get ahead of it, you're going to succeed. Those that don't.
We could say the exact same thing for AI right now. I mean,
exactly.
Exact same moment.
That's why the moment in time is, let's lift our heads up a little and say, all right, AI may, I don't know, but AI may change everything. So broad question, but let's take a very narrow focus. How does it change things for our industry? What is the capacity need for broadband at the home, at businesses, large business, small, rural homes, urban homes? What is the capacity need for broadband in the world of AI? And if people tell me like, well, nothing, not going to change anything. People always already use video. People already stream, predict. So, and I don't think the question should be answered by out of the usual suspects, policymakers, or let's go to the folks who invented the internet in the first place. Let's go to the Internet Society. Let's either ask them, take the people who are there, you know, the folks that are in the Internet Hall of Fame. It's like, what are the needs going to be in 5 to 10 years from now? Not today. 5 to 10 years from now, when you think that AI is fully integrated in society, what are the needs going to be? And let's plan for that, so that the next time there's some funding decision, next time there's some funding decision by the government, they don't just, like, you know, put their finger up in the wind and say, which, not just which way is it blowing, how strong is the wind blowing? 100 down, 20 up, which was set in the BEAD program, is a made up number. It's the earlier numbers for, look, the very first broadband definition coming out of the FCC was 200 kilobits. Yeah. 200 kilobits per second, right?
Well, it's always been a mistake to use speed as a proxy for broadband because it's forced us to make bad decisions, which, like all the cap programs on chasing minimum speeds.
Right. So instead of instead of 200 kilobits, 401, 10.1, 25.3, 100 down, 20 up, or even the silly gigabit down, 500 megabit up. What's the need? Let's just define it, including the upload speed. Because there's nobody that did any study that said 100 down, 20 up was the right number for the future. Nobody said, like, hey, let's study the needs of people who are content creators at the home.
Yeah.
The needs of people who are going to be the driver of new industries. What's their upload needs? Nobody said, let's examine that and say, it's 20 megabits per second. Because it wasn't done. It's all made up. So let's we have time now. Because the money spent, again, I wouldn't go back and relitigate how BEAD was done. The money is now going to be spent. Let's go out there and build our networks. But the next time, let's take at least a more deliberate approach, one that takes advantage of. I had this thought the other day, like the next time I would hire somebody, if I were back in the government hiring people, like the FCC is really good at hiring lawyers. It's stocked with lawyers. They're a great legal organization. The next time I would hire somebody, if I were back there, I'd ask them, what science fiction did you read as a kid? Yep. What science fiction do you still read? I don't need more lawyers. I need more imagination. That's
definitely.
Let's ask the people who had the imagination in the first place, that created the internet in the first place. What do you see in the future? Let's ask that question.
Right, because if it's not AI, it's quantum networking. If it's not quantum networking, you're building critical infrastructure for generations to come, and now we're going to be sitting there with so many communities that are not going to get the right critical infrastructure.
And then the other thing that I think we should, as an industry, start to look at is, what's actually being delivered. It's getting harder and harder to find what internet service providers are even promising to deliver, much less what is actually being delivered. You can't. It's internet access. It's internet access, but at what speeds is what you paid for being delivered to you? Because we all know it's not, for the most part. I can't think of another industry sector, another thing that we do in our normal lives that quite approximates what the internet access industry does, which is to say, okay, you're going to get an up to speed. You're going to get up to 100 meg. You're going to get up to 20 meg down. You're going to get up to, right? There's no up to in these other industries. If I go to the grocery store.
The power industry said, so you don't know if your lights are going to be coming on or not today. But
right. Right. But if I go to the grocery store and buy a dozen eggs, when I come home and open the carton, there's a dozen eggs there, right? At the door, I take it back to the grocery store. It's not an up to. You bought up to a dozen eggs. I open the carton, there's 4 eggs there. Well, today you got 4 eggs. I go buy gas. I have an electric vehicle, but when I used to buy gas, I go I prepay $50 of gas, and then I start pumping, and then at $22 it stops because I only got up to $50. I only got up to a gallon of milk. I only got up to, you name the industry. We don't do that, but we do. You get up to 100 meg. You get up to gigabit. You get up to 20 meg. You get up. Well, those of us who take public funding at least now have to comply with a speed test protocol, which I think if we're applied more broadly, this is what I think as an industry we should figure out. Let people know. We have to. Charter has to. Everybody that takes public money, all the hundreds of telephone companies that take, telecom companies that take public funds, we now all engage in a speed test protocol to show that we are delivering the thing that we're getting money for. Yep. You know, it didn't. We don't get to get away with. We have to deliver gigabit down, the silly 500 meg up. We don't even sell gigabit. We don't even sell 500 meg, but we have to deliver gigabit. We deliver that 98, 99% of the time, right? And it gets measured, because if we fail, the FCC takes our money away. Yeah. But that's not the case in general for the industry. And the public, you never really know. Yep. You never know, and since you don't know, this is again, I don't want the government to step in, the FTC, attorneys general. This is an industry problem that the industry should solve. How does the public know that the thing they're getting for, that they're not getting ripped off, that they're getting the thing that they paid for? I pay for something, I want it delivered to me.
Yeah, and the FCC attempted with broadband labels, but that was a failure. So we really have to have something that's, you know, not so cumbersome, but, you know, just gives the consumers confidence. You know, I had cable service, I had, quote, super fast, and I could not find anywhere to define what super fast was, you know, and it's really frustrating to a consumer to not really know what you're buying.
Look, I have a fiber in my home since 2002. I currently subscribe to, and this will sound ridiculous, but you know, I'm in the industry. I currently subscribe to fiber, a fiber service, a cable service, a fixed wireless service, and Starlink, as well as my mobile devices. I have a pretty good idea of the delivery of different technologies. So what do you want to talk about, Gary? We're out of time.
Well, we're out of time, but Jonathan, I really appreciate your insights and really all the work that you and your colleagues are doing to advance broadband in rural America, especially with rural electric co-ops. So you're always a wealth of information. Thanks so much for joining us today. And I look forward to getting them back together. Next Wednesday, we're going to have Dr. Tamara Holmes, broadband director for the state of Virginia, to talk about what's going on with Virginia's fiber projects and initiatives. So please join us next week. And thanks again, Jonathan. Always great to have you.
Thanks, Gary.